It's June, and that means it is time to start thinking about summer reading. I'm here with David Ulin and Carolyn Kellogg, and we're gonna help you compile your summer reading lists. One of the things that a lot of people like to add to their summer reading lists are mysteries and thrillers, and there are some really big names coming this summer, and also some lesser known names. David, you actually interviewed a great writer for our LA Times Summer Books preview, Alifair Burke.
Yeah, her new book, which is called All Day and a Night, which is actually prison slang for life without parole. I'm starting to use that around the house now. Is a book about two New York City detectives who are on the trail of a serial killer. This twist in this case is that it's a serial killer their suspect is someone who was convicted of the crimes but has been released because there were some questions about the confession and the quality of the evidence, and has become a kind of a political football. And it's a really well developed thriller where, you know, about 100 pages in, you think you know sort of what's happening, and then Burke just kind of keeps twisting it on you, but in a very realistic and a very effective way. So you're always on your toes while you're reading it.
So that's a good summer.
It's a really good summer read. I think she's quite a good writer. She's also a law professor, so she brings a lot of that material to it. So, you know, for me, one of the tests of a thriller is it's got to be believable, and it is extremely believable. Everything that happens, both legally, cop-wise, investigatively, and politically, just seems you could see how the story could just unfold in the world.
Does it have something to do with BTK too?
She was inspired by BTK. I shouldn't say inspired. That's actually the wrong word. But when she grew up in Wichita, Kansas, her father is James Lee Burke, the crime writer. Although he wasn't a crime writer when she was a kid, he became a crime writer, or he became a successful novelist after this. But she grew up in Wichita at the time that the BTK killer was operating. And she, as a child, sort of, I think she describes herself in the interview as an incredibly dark Encyclopedia Brown. She was convinced that she could solve the BTK case. And she and her father used to talk about it a lot. So in some ways that, I think, inspired some of these novels that she's written, not just this one. And in this book, the main character, the New York City detective who's the center of the series, her father is a detective in Wichita who worked on a case very much like the BTK case.
And another writer who has written about the BTK killer is Stephen King, who has a new book coming out just about now, Mr. Mercedes, which is a book about a man who drives into a crowd in a Mercedes, and a retired policeman who comes to try to solve that murder.
And King kind of goes back and forth these days between like his big sort of mysterious, like ethereal, things don't really make sense kind of unreal worlds and hard-boiled fiction, right? Like last summer he did like a hard-boiled book.
He did Joyland, which was a terrific little book that was about, there had a very slight supernatural component to it, but it was about a killer in an amusement park.
And this is this is a bigger book, but it's also like the hard-boiled realism.
Yeah, it's really interesting. He seems to kind of be king of all genre at this point. He's really seems to be able to master whatever he takes on.
Well, some of his big influences, I mean, I know he's a huge fan of the writer David Goodis, who was a pulp crime writer. So he's definitely coming out of that sort of broad genre territory. I mean, he's known as a horror writer, but a lot of the writers who he's championed and talked about are writers who come out of kind of mystery. And he did publish Joyland, and he published another book a few years ago with Hard Case Crime, which is a paperback house that really sort of specializes in kind of neo-noir type fiction. So he's always sort of had his feet in that territory.
We asked our readers via Twitter if they had summer reading plans, and I noticed that there were a couple of good titles, and among them some thrillery titles. Readers mentioned two titles again and again. One was I Am Pilgrim, which is a thriller that's out, I think in May, just came out, by Terry Hayes, and Landline by Rainbow Rowell, who is, I think, best known at this point as a YA writer, but she has a new adult-oriented novel out called Landline, which is a little bit, has a little supernatural twist. It's got, it's about a couple whose marriage is kind of on the rocks. She's a TV writer, and she and her husband are separated, and she starts using a telephone that is able to speak to her husband in the past, before their marriage got rocky, but she's really beloved. And a couple of others, Cold Sleep Lullaby by Andrew Brown, which is on, I think, on our extended summer list online, and The Last Magazine by Michael Hastings, who's the writer who got killed.
The investigative reporter, but this is a novel, right?
This was his first novel, and sadly, he didn't live to see it published. So that's just come out.
I read a book about somebody who's not with us anymore, but it's a really great and sort of fun book about Sally Ride.
The astronaut.
The astronaut. The subtitle is America's First Woman in Space, so if you don't know who Sally Ride is, the subtitle kind of takes care of it for you. It was written by the journalist Lynn Sher. She's a TV journalist, and she covered the space program when Sally Ride was one of the first class of women who were invited to be candidates for the space shuttle. And so she knew her way back then, and then she remained friends with her throughout her whole life. And the interesting thing about Sally Ride is that she was almost a tennis pro. She became an astrophysicist at Stanford. She went up in the air, and then when she stopped being an astronaut, she got into a same-sex relationship, which remained secret for 27 years.
It's incredible.
And in her obituary, sort of came out, told her partner that she would be comfortable with that. So there was sort of this big secret that becomes a part of the book and is an open part of the book all the way through, and it was really interesting.
And I think that must have been a question for Cher, how much to reveal.
And what she decided was that it was always a part of Ride's life, so she was going to try to deal with it chronologically. So as she had same-sex relationships that people maybe in NASA didn't know about, she felt comfortable writing about those. But she was also married to an astronaut for a time, so unfortunately it was during the Reagan era when being a bisexual astronaut was really not a possibility.
There are a couple of other really big memoirs coming, and one of them we don't have in front of us because it's embargoed, and it'll be out, I think, June 10th, the big Hillary Clinton memoir.
Right, the political, what is it? It's really the beginning of the presidential campaign.
It's a launch,
I would
right?
think, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems fairly obvious that it's a launch, and of course it will be picked over.
Like everything.
You know, everything from Benghazi to what she says about being a mother, and it's gonna I think have a life of its own. But I'm guessing it'll also be a fun and interesting summer read. They're also, I mean, they're everything from Ja Rule has a memoir to who else? What are the other memoirs? Germaine Greer.
Right, the Germaine Greer book, which looks quite interesting and sort of not necessarily what we might expect Germaine Greer to write about. It's about a
serious feminist.
Serious feminist. First line, really sort of
the female eunuch is
female eunuch, right? One of the founders of contemporary feminism. Very political. I mean, I guess this book has its political component. It's about essentially a rainforest reclamation project on a property she bought in Australia. She is Australian. And in some ways it's about sort of changing the world, one small piece at a time. The impact of the individual, granted an individual with acreage to play with, but nonetheless an individual. And I'm really curious about this idea of Germaine Greer as a kind of neo-environmentalist in some way.
She's a great writer.
Great writer, yeah, really vibrant, really smart, able to make all sorts of interesting connections. So, but an interesting direction for her to move in, I think, as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of sort of food, environmental books on our list. There was a sort of fun book about local food.
You know, I'm trying to remember the name of the author, and I can't, but it's right
It's
there
on our
table.
It's upside down.
He's one of the earliest locavores, and what he did was he went around and spoke to all these people like Alice Waters and stuff about what it means to be a foodie and into like growing local and eating local and trying to get a handle on that sort of in an encyclopedic way.
Yeah.
Through all these different people's voices and ideas.
And there's also a book by Dan Barber, who is the chef at Stone Barn at Blue Hills, who also very much pioneered that whole kind of way of life and really talking seriously about the issue of locavores and food. So
there's a fun book that I know isn't there that's about food, but it's also a murder mystery. It's somebody tried to murder the world's most expensive wine by threatening to poison the vines, and this is a story about that. It happened in Italy, I think, or France. I don't know.
Yeah, that's all on our list on latimes.com/books. We have a couple of other readers chiming in on Twitter. S by J.J. Abrams and Doug Dorst, which I think came out last year, and The Black Count by Tom Rice, which was a great historical book.
Which won the Pulitzer Prize, didn't it? Did it not, or was it a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize last year, The Black Count? I think it was.
It was a great book. It was about the Alexandre Dumas. It was about the father of the guy who wrote Three Musketeers and all these, and because his real life was sort of an inspiration for his son, the author, and he was from Africa, and he was a black Frenchman.
Yeah, it was a really unexpected history.
Yeah, who Napoleon hated and eventually like imprisoned, just like the Count of Monte Cristo.
Exactly. Like art imitates life.
Yeah, I have a soft spot for literary histories and literary stories. So there's a novel coming out this summer called The 100-Year House by Rebecca Mackay, who I don't know anything about, but the novel is about a physical property that was owned by a writer and then becomes sort of a writer's retreat, like these places like Yaddo or McDowell. But it follows the history of this house going backwards in time as some people move in as a caretaker. And I like the idea of like a house as a place and how place informs fiction and informs what people write. So I'm kind of excited about it.
Well, several readers who are poring over the Summer Books preview said they were feeling gleefully overwhelmed by the, I think, how many? We had 143, at least online. The print version was a little bit shorter, but online I think we had 143 picks in there. And that, you know, frankly, is only a small proportion of the books that, you know, are coming out this summer, and even the good books. I mean, there are plenty of good books that we missed. So, you know, that raises the question of you know, how can you possibly keep on top of summer reading? And I think really there are different strategies. I mean, some people have a huge pile, and they just sort of go through them like candy, and I suppose it depends how much free time you have.
And how long the books are.
And how long the books are. And David's strategy that he wrote about in the summer preview was to reject the idea of the easy, fun, you know, beach thriller, and to really take on some pretty ambitious, big and ambitious projects.
Right. To go for it, right? I mean, I've always felt like since I've been a little kid, I always sort of look forward to summer as a reading space to read stuff that I wouldn't have time to read otherwise. Now that I read for a living, that's, you know, it's a different kind of thing. But I always have liked this idea of the ambitious summer read. So books that I was sort of looking at going back a little bit was the Piketty book, the Thomas Piketty book, Capital in the 21st century.
That's a light fiction, right?
That's a light fiction, yeah.
What is it?
It's a book about income inequality. And
it's a really important topic.
Which is an important topic. It's an important sort of statistical analysis in some way by an economist about.
I'd like to see the reaction on the beach.
I would like to see the reaction on the beach too, if I ever go to the beach, if I'm not just sitting at home reading. I have spent the last several weeks inside the head of Mr. Knausgaard, of Carl Ove Knausgaard, who's the author of this 6-volume, 3,600-page autobiographical project called My Struggle,
Which is always a good title for a light summer.
Always a good title for light
struggle.
summer. You know, it's
in case other people like me don't speak German, that's what Mein Kampf was.
Right.
Was my struggle.
And
so it's a play. Is it a play on Hitler? What
no,
is it?
it's I mean, it's an interesting question. So first of all, the first three volumes have been translated into English, so it's a hard project to talk about because even if you are up to speed, you've only read half of it. It's a provocation, and I think the entire book is in many ways a provocation. I think you know, the idea of taking that title, which is one of the most loaded titles you can imagine, is an act of provocation. And the idea of writing 3,600 pages of sort of minutia about one's life, because it's an extremely ordinary life, and that's part of the point. You know, there's a way in which, you know, when you read 65 pages about a 4-year-old's birthday party, which is kind of one of the best and weirdest parts of the book, because anyone who's ever been to a 4-year-old's birthday party has had exactly the reactions he's had to a 4-year-old's birthday party, but you don't expect to see it played out, you know, sort of second by second. There's a real, I just, in a way, it's very exciting for me to sort of watch someone invest his own kind of non-epic life with an epic stature, and I think in some ways a kind of weird transference takes place. I'm a fan, I have to say.
Okay, so I haven't read Proust yet, but Proust like also famously did like a really huge book of the minutiae of daily life. Should I read Nausgard instead of Proust?
I haven't read Proust either, so I can't answer that question. I will say Proust never Proust never wrote about like the Jam and the Boomtown Rats, which are part of this Nausgard book.
So if I like my 80s music, it's okay for me to read the Nausgard.
Surprisingly accessible for like a 6,000 word.
Exactly.
It's not that big.
It's not that big. You know, you can read it in a couple of months. There's your summer.
And I think the other one that you wrote about was one of the many Nixon books.
The Rick Perlstein book, which is The Invisible Bridge, which is a book about sort of the transition from, basically from Nixon to Reagan in some way, and the rise of Reagan and the rise of what we now know as or think of as kind of the conservative right, but really, you know, meant something quite different in the 1970s before Reagan came to prominence. And it's a fascinating idea. I mean, Perlstein wrote a book called Nixonland that came out, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, which was really about the rise of Nixon. It's a kind of, it's a very well-researched history, but it's a broad-based, he's a broad-based historian, so he's looking at cultural history as well as political history and how they come together. And I'm fascinated by this book because I remember being shocked when Reagan was nominated in 1980. And that he was being taken seriously. But although I've come to think of it as more of a kind of historical inevitability, and I think that that's part of the territory that Perlstein is writing from, sort of a broad sweep of American culture. Reagan is a kind of inevitable counterweight, let's say, to both to sort of Nixon and a kind of more mainstream conservatism on the Republican side, but also the sort of radicalism of the left in the 1960s. That in many ways that was a cultural progression that led to Reagan, as opposed to some kind of great seismic shift.
So that's another great potential serious book, and it sounds like some of our readers have taken a leaf out of David's book, and we've got Ray Anthony Soto is planning to read Robert Frost's poetry collection. Melissa Tank Girl is tackling A Confederacy of Dunces, which is a fun summer read, and says next she's going to do David Foster Wallace's Pale King and Jonathan Franzen's Freedom. So she has a good summer of hardcore reading.
And there is, I think, I was reading like the Infinite Summer thing from a few years ago when there was a group on the internet that read Infinite Jest. There is now going to be the Pale Summer this summer, right?
I think maybe there's a plan to have a sort of group reading of David Foster Wallace's Pale King.
Something she might want to make room for, if she has time, because she sounds like she really likes her literary fiction, is Haruki Murakami's book, which is coming out at the beginning of August, I think.
Really looking forward to that.
Which is Colorless Suzaki
and His Years of Pilgrimage.
Great title.
Yeah, it looks like it's a book about a man who has a mysterious breakup with a group of very close friends who just suddenly drop him, And as with a lot of Murakami's books, it starts with what seems like a simple premise, and kind of marvelous things happen from there.
There will be cats and wells and and precocious young girls.
Yes, there will be things that you cannot imagine. So thank you guys for coming. Everybody, you can find our summer books preview online at latimes.com/summerbooks, and there are more than 100 choices. And I'm hoping that you can find something great to read for your summer. Thanks.